There is belief, and then there is skepticism. And between those two lies a vast territory of questions and the unknown. But what if reality is far more complex than we've been willing to perceive? And what if the stories that we dismiss as myth and legend hold the keys to understanding consciousness? From ghostly encounters to mysterious lights in the sky, humanity has always sensed there was something more out there. Some call it the paranormal, and others call it the divine. Some search the stars for answers, while others look within. They are all connected, threads in the grand tapestry of life. But we stand at a place where the fabric between realities is much thinner than you might think, because this is Crossroads of the Veil. Tonight we begin a journey into one of the most violent, controversial, and enduring mysteries in North American folklore. It is a story that has been whispered around campfires for a century. A story that transformed a quiet patch of Washington wilderness into ground zero for the unexplained. This is not just a story about a monster. It is a story about the fragile boundary between our civilized world, the world of electric lights, paved roads, and rational explanations, and the ancient breathing darkness that watches from the tree line. We are going back to 1924, to the Pacific Northwest, to a place that the locals call the Dark Divide. But before we climb that mountain, we have to understand the soil we are standing on. You see, the story of the Siege of Ape Canyon didn't really begin on a hot July night in a miner's cabin. It began thousands of years before, in the oral traditions of the people who lived in the shadow of the Fire Mountains. And it began in the journals of the frontiersmen who first tried to tame this continent. We like to think of the wild man, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or the Yeti as a modern obsession, something born of tabloid newspapers and shaky video footage from the 1960s. But that is a comfortable lie we tell ourselves to keep the mystery at arm's length. The truth is much older. The truth is written in the blood and fear of men who conquered the frontier, only to find that the frontier was looking back at them. Long before the 5 miners we will meet, shortly ever picked up a pickaxe, the indigenous tribes of the Pacific Northwest, the Cowlitz, the Yakima, the Klickitat, knew that the high country was not empty. They knew that the snow-capped peaks of the Cascades were not just scenery, they were territory. They called them the Siatic, or sometimes the Tsiatko. In the Salish dialects, the name doesn't just mean big ape, it carries a heavier weight. It translates roughly to the night people or the wild one. And the descriptions passed down through generations of elders are chillingly consistent. These were not just animals. A bear is an animal. A cougar is an animal. The Siatic were something else. They were described as giants, standing 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in hair, wandering the cedar forest like ghosts. But here's where the legend gets under your skin. The tribes didn't fear them because they were big. They feared them because they were uncanny. The legends say they could throw their voices, using ventriloquism to lure hunters off the trail. They could paralyze a man with a single vibrating shout. They were the guardians of the high places, the enforcers of a boundary that said, "You may hunt in the valley, but the peaks belong to us." This wasn't just a superstition to keep children in line. It was a survival manual. And when the white settlers arrived, confident in their rifles and their God, they thought they could ignore the boundaries. They thought the wild man was just a story. Daniel Boone, the very archetype of the American frontiersman, knew better. There is a persistent fragment of history buried in the footnotes of his life that claims Boone once confessed to killing a 10-foot tall, hairy giant he called a Yahoo. Now it is likely a phonetic corruption of a Cherokee term for a similar creature. Boone didn't make a trophy of it. He buried the story, perhaps because he knew that some things are too strange for the civilized world to digest. Then there is the story Theodore Roosevelt, the President of the United States, told. In his 1893 book, The Wilderness Hunter, Roosevelt recounted the terrifying experience of a trapper named Bauman. It happened near the Wisdom River in Montana. Bauman and his partner were stalked for days by a bipedal creature that ransacked their camp, not to steal food, but to destroy. It left footprints that were undeniably human-like, but massive. The stalking ended in violence. Bauman returned to camp to find his partner dead, his neck broken, with 4 deep fang marks in the throat. Roosevelt wrote of the event not as a ghost story or folklore, but as a report. He called it a goblin, struggling to find the language to describe a predator that hunted men for sport. This is the legacy that our 5 miners were walking into. They weren't walking into an empty forest. They were walking into a haunted house that spanned millions of acres. Let's set the scene. The year is 1924. Mount St. Helens is not the broken, cratered ruin we know today. Before the 1980 eruption, it was perfect. A symmetrical snow-white cone that people called the Fujiyama of America. It was beautiful, and on its eastern flank, there was a place where the deep timber gave way to a desolate, pumice-covered plain known as the Plains of Abraham. This area is rugged, it's steep. It's a place where the volcanic earth eats sound. And it was here, at a spot called Pumice Butte, that 5 men decided to stake their claim. Let's meet them. First, there was Marion Smith. He was the leader of the party, a veteran prospector who had spent his life reading the rocks. He was a pragmatist. He didn't believe in goblins, he believed in gold. Then there was his son, Roy Smith, young, tough, and by some accounts, a little trigger-happy. He was there to work, but he was also there to protect his father. There was Gabe Lefevre and John Peterson, both experienced outdoorsmen, men who knew the difference between the sound of a bear crashing through brush and the sound of something stalking. And finally, there was Fred Beck. Fred Beck is the voice of our story. He was the youngest. Years later, he would write the definitive account of what happened, a book titled, I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens. Beck was different. While the others looked at the mountain and saw mineral deposits, Beck looked at the mountain and saw energy. He was a man who claimed to have vision, a man who believed they were guided to this spot not by a geological survey, but by a spirit guide. But in July of 1924, Fred Beck wasn't talking about spirits. He was talking about the feeling of being watched. The group had been working their claim, the Vander White, for weeks. They had built a sturdy log cabin, pine logs chinked with clay, built to withstand the crushing weight of winter snow. It was a fortress, or so they thought. The trouble didn't start with a roar. You know that feeling when you are alone in a room, and you suddenly feel eyes on the back of your neck? Imagine that feeling amplified by the vastness of the wilderness. For days the men had been on edge. It was the little things. A stone clattering down a slope when there was no wind. The snapping of a branch that sounded too heavy to be a deer. Fred Beck would later describe a peculiar sound that began to drift out of the tree line at dusk. It wasn't a howl. It was a hollow thumping, a rhythmic booming sound, like a drum beating underground, or like a massive chest being struck by a massive fist. The men tried to rationalize it. It's a grouse, they said. It's the wind in a hollow log. But seasoned woodsmen know the sound of a grouse. This was visceral. It was a sound that you felt in your stomach before you heard it with your ears. Then came the whistling. It wasn't a bird. It was a sharp, piercing whistle that would cut through the twilight air from one ridge. And then, terrifyingly, it would be answered by a similar whistle from the opposite ridge. They were being signaled. They were being triangulated. Marion Smith, the skeptic, tried to keep the crew focused on the gold. They were hitting good ore. They were close to a strike, but the unease was growing like a cancer in the camp. The men returned to the cabin that evening in silence. The excitement of the gold was gone, replaced by a primal instinct. They checked the latch on the door. They checked the loads in their rifles. They stoked the fire, not just for warmth, but for light. The watchers on the ridge had seen enough. The boundary had been crossed. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the Cascades, casting long purple shadows over the plains of Abraham, the 5 miners of the Vander White claim were about to find out exactly what happens when you ignore the warnings. If you look at a map of the Pacific Northwest, specifically the area surrounding Mount St. Helens, you see a landscape defined by violence. Not the violence of men, but the violence of geology. It is a place of jagged ridges, sudden drop-offs, and volcanic scree that shifts under your boots like granulated sugar. In 1924, this was not a place for tourists. It was a place for men who were willing to gamble their lives against the mountain for a few ounces of yellow metal. To understand the terror that was about to unfold at Ape Canyon, we have to understand the men who walked into it. We have to peel back the layers of history and look at the faces of the Van der Weydt expedition. Because when the screaming started, these were the men who had to hold the line. We touched on them briefly, but let's really look at them. At the head of the table sat Marion Smith. In the original accounts written by Fred Beck, he is often referred to by the pseudonym Hank, a choice made to protect his privacy in the aftermath of the hysteria. But history remembers him as Marion. He was the engine of the group, a man of the earth, a prospector who measured the world in payload and profit. He was tough, reportedly possessing a short temper when things went sideways. But he was also the glue holding the operation together. He drove the Ford Model T that brought them up the treacherous logging roads. He was the one who swore that neither God nor the devil could drive him away from a gold claim. Then there was his son, Roy Smith. He was the younger energy, the muscle. In 1924, he was looking for a future, following his father's lead into the high country. He was armed, he was capable, and he was likely the most reactive member of the group. Rounding out the crew were Gabe Lefevre and John Peterson. These men are the quiet ones in the history books. They didn't write memoirs, they didn't give endless interviews. They were working men, prospectors who signed up for hard labor and isolation. And then there was Fred Beck. Fred Beck is the anomaly. In a group of materialists looking for gold, Beck was looking for something else. He was the wild card. By his own admission, Beck had been clairvoyant since childhood. He claimed to see visions, to hear voices, to sense things that others couldn't. And this is where the story of Ape Canyon takes a sharp turn into the twilight zone. According to Beck, the group wasn't just looking for gold at random. They were being led. Years later, Beck would reveal that he had experienced a vision of a massive spiritual entity, a large Native American figure dressed in buckskin. This entity, which Beck referred to as the Great Spirit or simply the Guide, had given them specific instructions. It told them of a deposit of gold, a treasure hidden in the cliffs of Mount St. Helens. But the Guide gave them a warning, a cryptic, chilling message that should have made them turn the car around. The spirit showed Beck an image of a great door in the side of the cliff. The door swung open to reveal the gold, but then it swung shut. Beck noticed a massive lock on the door, but as it closed, the latch didn't click. The voice told him, "You will be shown where there is gold, but it will not just be given to you." The door was closed, but not locked. It was a test, or perhaps it was a trap. Beck told the men that a white arrow, invisible to most but blazing bright to his psychic eyes, would lead them to the spot. And so, incredibly, these hard-nosed miners followed the visionary. They followed Beck's invisible arrow up the Lewis River, up the muddy river, climbing higher and higher into the desolate volcanic plains. You can imagine the tension. Marion Smith sweating, cursing the heat and the flies, hiking up a vertical incline because Fred Beck saw a magic arrow pointing the way. At one point, Smith reportedly snapped, cursing the spirit, cursing the arrow, calling it a wild goose chase. But then the arrow stopped. It hovered, according to Beck, right over a steep, dangerous cliff on the north side of a deep gorge. They found the gold, or at least they found traces of it. They blasted a ledge into the side of the cliff and started digging. They built their cabin, a sturdy windowless blockhouse made of horizontal logs. About a mile or so from the claim, they settled in. They had beaten the mountain. They had followed the ghost and found the treasure. But the mountain was waking up. The first sign wasn't a monster, it was a feeling. The transition from the lower forest to the high alpine zone is jarring. The air gets thinner. The trees get stunted, twisted by the wind. The silence is profound. But after a few weeks at the Van der Weydt mine, the silence began to feel occupied. It started in the evenings. The men would be sitting around the fire, eating their beans and hotcakes, exhausting the day's conversation. And then from the ridgeline, they would hear it. Fred Beck described it as a booming sound. He said it sounded just like something was hitting itself on its chest. In 1924, the average American's knowledge of great ape behavior was non-existent. The image of a gorilla beating its chest was not a pop culture staple yet. King Kong wouldn't hit theaters for another 9 years. For a group of miners in Washington state to describe distinct rhythmic chest beating is a detail that lends incredible weight to their story. It's a specific biological behavior associated with territorial display. But there was something else about the sound. It was hollow. It seemed to vibrate in the ground. Modern researchers have speculated about low-frequency sound waves that tigers and elephants use to communicate. Infrasound has a physical effect on humans. It causes anxiety. It causes nausea. It causes a profound, irrational sense of dread. Marion Smith tried to investigate. He walked away from the camp one afternoon, tracking the noise. He walked for half an hour, stopping to listen. Every time he stopped, the thumping would start again, sometimes ahead of him, sometimes behind him. It was elusive. It was mocking him. He returned to camp pale and shaken, telling the boys, "It sounds like there's a hollow drum in the earth somewhere." Then came the whistles. It would start at twilight, that gray hour when shapes lose their definition. A shrill, piercing whistle would erupt from a ridge a few hundred yards away, and then, from a completely different direction, a second whistle would answer. This wasn't random noise, it was coordination. The miners realized they were being flanked. They were being observed by a group that could communicate over distance, a group that was tracking their movements. The psychological pressure was immense. Imagine trying to sleep in a cabin with no windows, knowing that just outside, in the pitch black, something is signaling your position. But fear is a funny thing. It can be ignored if you have a job to do. And these men had gold to mine. They pushed the fear down. They gripped their rifles a little tighter. They told themselves it was just the wind, just a cougar, just the mountain devils the Indians talked about. Spooky, sure, but not real. That was until the day they found the tracks. It was about a week before the attack. The men were down by the creek near a sandbar where the water slowed down. It was a pristine patch of earth. Marion Smith saw them first. He stopped dead in his tracks. There, stamped into the damp sand, were footprints, but they weren't the blurred, indistinct depressions of a bear. They were sharp, they were clear, and they were massive. The men gathered around, staring down at the impossible. They measured them. 19 inches. A 19-inch foot implies a creature of staggering proportion. If you scale up a human body to match a foot that size, you are looking at a being that stands between 8 and 9 feet tall and weighs anywhere from 600 to 900 pounds. But it wasn't just the size, it was the shape. Fred Beck noted a detail that has puzzled and fascinated researchers for a century. He said the prints didn't look like a giant human foot. He said the toes were short and stubby. This is a critical detail. A human foot has long, articulate toes for balance and walking. A bear has claws. But a massive, bipedal primate, a creature designed to carry nearly 1,000 pounds of muscle through vertical terrain, would need a different kind of foot, a flat, heavy pad, thick, sausage-like toes to grip the volcanic soil. Beck looked at the tracks. He looked at the stride, massive steps that cleared obstacles no man could step over. He saw no boot marks, no claw marks, just the heavy, undeniable press of flesh against the earth. Fred Beck looked at the dense, impenetrable forest that surrounded them. He looked at his rifle, a .30-30 Winchester that suddenly felt very small in his hand. Marion Smith, the skeptic, the man who cursed the spirits, stood up and looked at the dense timberline. He wasn't cursing now. He famously remarked that no human being could have made these tracks. He suggested that the only way they could have gotten there was if something had dropped from the sky. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The thumping wasn't the earth. The whistling wasn't the wind. The watchers were real. They were biological. They were massive, and they were right on top of them. The miners retreated to their cabin that night with a new understanding. The wilderness wasn't empty. They were trespassing, and the owners of the land were getting impatient. The creatures had shown themselves in the sand, leaving a calling card that said, "We are here." But the miners didn't leave. The gold fever, or perhaps simply the stubborn pride of men who refused to be scared off by spooks, kept them there. They didn't know it, but the clock was ticking down. The date is July 11th, 1924. It is a Friday. Up on the eastern flank of Mount St. Helens, the sun is blazing. The heat in the high Cascades can be deceptive, creating a shimmering haze that distorts distances and plays tricks on the eye. But what happened next wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a mirage. It was the moment the Cold War between the Vanderwhite prospectors and the watchers in the wood turned hot. By this point in the week, the atmosphere in the camp had curdled. The excitement of the gold strike had been replaced by a gnawing, restless anxiety. The thumping in the ground and the whistling from the ridges had done their work. The men were exhausted. their nerves frayed by nights of listening to the darkness. Fred Beck would later recall that he had a toothache that day, a throbbing, persistent pain that seemed to pulse in time with the heat. He asked Marion Smith, the group's leader, to drive him into town to see a dentist. It was a plea for escape. Beck wanted off the mountain, but Marion was possessed by the gold fever. He was a man who had spent years chasing the mother lode, and now that he was standing on top of it, he wasn't about to leave for a toothache. Marion's reply was etched in stone. God or the devil could not get him away from there. Those words would hang in the air like a curse, because the devil, or something very much like it, was about to accept the challenge. Late in the afternoon, the water supply in the cabin was running low. In the wilderness, water is life, but getting it meant leaving the safety of the camp and walking to the spring. The spring was located about 100 yards away across a small, steep-sided canyon. In normal circumstances, fetching water is a chore, a mundane task, but on this day it was a tactical operation. Marion Smith turned to Fred Beck and said, "Let's take our rifles to be on the safe side." Marion carried his Remington automatic. Fred Beck carried his .30-30 Winchester, a lever-action rifle that is an icon of the American West. These were weapons designed to drop elk and grizzly bears. They walked in silence, the pumice crunching loudly under their boots. The air was still. The birds, usually active in the late afternoon, were silent. The forest was holding its breath. They reached the spring, filled their buckets, and turned to head back. That's when the world tilted. Marion Smith stopped. He yelled, a sharp guttural shout of alarm, and raised his rifle in a single fluid motion. Fred Beck looked up, and there, standing on the opposite side of the little canyon, about 100 yards away, was the source of all their fear. It wasn't a shadow. It was standing by a pine tree, fully illuminated by the afternoon sun. Beck described it with chilling clarity. It was a hairy creature. It stood about 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in blackish-brown hair, but it was the behavior that shattered any illusion that this was a bear. Bears don't stand by trees and watch you. Bears don't use cover. This creature was intelligent. As soon as Marion raised his rifle, the creature dodged. It moved with a speed and fluidity that defied its size, slipping behind the trunk of the pine tree for protection. But it didn't run away. It was curious. It was assessing the threat. Beck watched as the creature poked its head out from the side of the tree to look at them. It was playing a game of peekaboo. Marion Smith didn't hesitate. He was protecting his claim, his son, and his life. He squeezed the trigger of the Remington. The sound of the gunshot slapped against the canyon walls, echoing like a thunderclap. Beck saw the impact. He saw the bark fly off the side of the pine tree, right where the creature's head had been a split second before. Marion fired again. More bark exploded from the tree, and again. 3 shots, 3 warnings, or 3 attempts to kill. Marion Smith was a good shot. He would later tell Beck, "Don't worry about that devil, Fred. I got him right in the head." He was convinced he had hit it. He believed the bullets had found their mark, but the creature didn't fall. It disappeared from view for a moment, slipping back into the shadows of the timber. But then it broke cover. Beck saw it running not on all fours like a bear, but running fast and upright on 2 legs. It was moving down the little canyon, covering ground with terrifying speed, putting distance between itself and the gun. It was running, but it wasn't panicked. It was moving with purpose. Fred Beck raised his Winchester. He tracked the running figure leading it, trying to find a clear shot through the trees. He fired 3 times. The heavy .30-30 slugs tore through the air, kicking up dust and splintering wood. But the creature didn't stop. It vanished into the heavy brush about 200 yards down the canyon. Silence rushed back into the void left by the gunfire. The smell of gunpowder hung in the hot air. The 2 men stood there, chests heaving, rifles smoking. They looked at each other, and in that moment the gold didn't matter. The toothache didn't matter, and their pride didn't matter anymore. They had done the unthinkable. They had opened fire on the locals. If the whistling and the thumping were warnings, this was a declaration of war. In the animal kingdom, if you shoot at a predator and miss, or worse, if you wound it, you change the dynamic. You stop being a curiosity and start being a threat that must be neutralized. And if these creatures were as intelligent as their behavior suggested, if they had a language, a social structure, and a sense of territory, then Marion and Fred had just committed an act of aggression that would demand a response. They grabbed the water buckets, sloshing precious liquid onto the dry ground, and hurried back to the cabin. They moved differently now. They walked back to back, scanning the tree line, checking their six. Every shadow looked like a 7-foot hairy man. Every rustle of dry grass sounded like a footstep. When they burst into the cabin, the other men, Roy Smith, Gabe Lefevre, and John Peterson, were waiting. They had heard the shots. 6 rounds fired in rapid succession is not a hunting pattern. It's a panic pattern. Marion and Fred told their story. They described the creature, the pine tree, the way it dodged, the way it ran upright. They described the bark flying. The skepticism that had lingered in the camp evaporated. You don't empty your magazine at a shadow. The mood in the cabin shifted instantly from hold the ground to evacuate. Even Marion Smith, the man who defied God and the devil, was done. The reality of the situation had shaken him. The group held a council of war. They agreed on one thing. We go home at first light the next morning. It was too late to leave now. The sun was already dipping low. The hike out to the Ford Model T was treacherous, and the idea of being caught on the trail in the dark with those things out there was suicide. They decided to bunker down. They would spend one last night in the cabin, pack up, and abandon the Vander White claim forever. It's better to lose the supplies than our lives, Marion would later say. They thought they had a plan. They thought they could wait it out, but they had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed the creatures would be frightened by the guns. They assumed the loud noise and the flying lead would send the mountain devils running for the deep caves. Scared of the white man's thunder, they were wrong. As the sun finally set behind the peaks, plunging the canyon into a deep velvety darkness, the men secured the cabin. This was a solid structure, no windows, a heavy hewn log door, a fireplace made of rocks. It felt safe. It felt like a fortress. They cooked a meager dinner, but nobody had much of an appetite. Fred Beck noted that his toothache had miraculously vanished, cured by the adrenaline of the encounter. Somehow the excitement seemed to work as a temporary cure for it. They sat around smoking their pipes, trying to normalize the situation. They talked about the trip home, the road, and they talked about anything except the thing Marion had shot at by the pine tree. They tried to sleep. The cabin had a long bunk bed where 2 men could sleep, feet to feet. The others slept on pine boughs on the floor. Marion Smith, perhaps feeling the weight of his responsibility as leader, or perhaps feeling the guilt of firing the first shot, took a spot on the floor. He kept his Remington automatic right beside him. Fred Beck kept his Winchester within arm's reach. The fire died down to embers. The cabin went dark. The men drifted into a restless, shallow sleep, listening. For a few hours, there was nothing. Just the wind. Just the settling of the logs. It seemed like just maybe they had gotten away with it. Maybe the creature was gone. Maybe it was dead. But those creatures don't forget, and they don't forgive. Around midnight, the silence was shattered. It didn't start with a whistle this time. If you have ever been in a car accident, you know that time doesn't speed up, it slows down. You notice the dust particles floating in the air. You hear the individual ticking of the cooling engine. The coming chaos of midnight on July 11, 1924, unfolded with that same agonizing clarity. Fred Beck was jolted awake by a sound that he would remember for the rest of his life, a tremendous thud against the cabin wall. It wasn't a branch or a pine cone. It sounded like a boulder had been hurled with superhuman force against the logs. The impact was so massive and violent. We are talking about kinetic energy that rivals a sledgehammer swing. It was something physically impossible for a mere animal to do. The dried clay packing between the logs exploded inward. Chunks of dried mud rained down on the men sleeping on the floor. Imagine waking up in pitch darkness, the air suddenly thick with dust, choking on the debris of your own shelter. Marion Smith was on the floor, thrashing, screaming, fighting off an invisible weight that had just landed on his chest. In the confusion, he thought some of the creature itself had broken in. He was waving his Remington automatic in the dark, a loaded weapon in a crowded room, shouting at a shadow that wasn't there. Fred Beck, the youngest but seemingly the most composed in that initial shock, grabbed Marion. He pulled the chunks of dried mud off the older man's chest. "It's the wall," he yelled. "They're hitting the wall." Then came the sound that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Outside, the darkness was alive. Beck described it as a great commotion. It sounded like a stampede. The miners had a pile of unused cedar shakes, long split shingles meant for roofing, stacked outside the cabin. The creatures were running over them. The sound was a chaotic, clattering roar, like a great number of feet trampling and rattling. This is a crucial detail in the forensic reconstruction of the event. A single animal, even a large one, moves with a certain cadence. This sounded like a riot. It sounded like a platoon, and it confirmed their worst fear. They were outnumbered. The men grabbed their guns and scrambled for their positions. They were veterans of the frontier, and instinct took over. They didn't huddle in the center of the room. They moved to the wall. The gaps where the chinking had been knocked out became unplanned loopholes, firing ports. Hank squinted through the jagged hole in the clay. The moonlight outside was sparse, filtered through the towering firs and the canyon walls, but it was enough to see movement. He saw them. In his later accounts, Beck was very specific. He didn't see a swarm of hundreds. He said, by actual count, we saw only 3 of the creatures together at one time. But the noise, the running, the thumping, the whistling, suggested there were many more hiding in the shadows, rotating in and out of the light. It was a classic guerrilla tactic. Make the enemy believe you are legion. Then the bombardment began. Cryptozoologists and folklorists have a word for what happened next: lithoboly, the throwing of stone. It is a phenomenon reported in poltergeist cases, in indigenous spirit lore, and overwhelmingly in Sasquatch encounters. But this wasn't a few pebbles tossed to scare a camper. This was an artillery barrage. The popular legend of Ape Canyon, the version that gets told in sensational tabloids, often claims that the creatures threw giant boulders through the roof, crushing the interior. Fred Beck, in his 1967 memoir, was careful to correct this. He wrote, "This was not quite the case. The geography of Pumice Butte simply didn't have large boulders sitting around waiting to be thrown. What they threw were rocks, fist-sized, head-sized rocks, but they threw them with such velocity and precision that the effect was just as terrifying. A rock would slam into the heavy log walls, shaking the entire structure. A rock would hit the cedar roof, the sound magnified by the hollow attic space, rolling down the pitch like a heavy bowling ball. Some of the rocks were targeted with uncanny accuracy. They came crashing down the chimney of the stone fireplace, bouncing onto the hearth, scattering ash and embers across the floor. The miners were taking fire from the wall, the roof, and the chimney, and they fired back. The cabin erupted in gunfire. The Remington automatic barked. The sharp crack of the 30-30 Winchester joined in. The muzzle flashes lit up the interior of the cabin like a lightning strike, freezing the terrified faces of the men in split-second portraits of horror. They weren't firing blindly, they were firing at targets. Beck and Smith stood at the gaps, watching for the dark, hulking shapes to move across the skyline. Every time a shadow moved, they pulled the trigger. Beck noted a chilling pattern. When they would quiet down for a few minutes, we would quit shooting. It was a standoff, a conversation spoken in bullets and stones. Beck, trying to find some logic in the madness, yelled to the other men. Maybe if they saw we were only shooting when they attacked, they might realize we were only defending ourselves. It was a desperate hope, a plea for diplomacy with a species they couldn't understand. But the creatures didn't want a truce. They wanted the miners out, or worse, they wanted them dead. The attack shifted. The bombardment stopped, and the physical assault began. The cabin had a heavy hewn log door. It was built to keep out bears. It was built to keep out the cold. It wasn't built to withstand the calculated leverage of a siege engine. Someone or something was on the other side, pushing. The heavy wood groaned under the pressure. The latch strained. The entire door frame shuddered as if a massive weight was being thrown against it repeatedly. The men froze. If that door opened, the game was over. In the tight confines of the cabin, 5 men with long rifles would be useless against 3 or 4 7-foot giants with the strength to twist saplings. It would be a slaughter. They needed a brace. They scrambled to the bunk bed. In a panic, they tore a long, sturdy pole from the frame of the bed. They jammed one end against the center of the door and the other end against the floor, creating a deadbolt that transferred the force into the earth. The pushing continued, but it held. The creatures, frustrated by the door, turned their attention to the walls. Beck described a sensation that defies belief. The creatures began to push against the corners of the cabin, heaving in unison. The structure groaned. They pushed against the walls of the cabin as if trying to push the cabin over, Beck wrote. Imagine the strength required to rock a log cabin. We are talking about thousands of pounds of timber interlocked and settled on a foundation. And yet, the men inside felt the floor shift. They felt the walls tremble. It was a display of raw physical power designed to induce sheer terror, and it worked. Inside, the other three men, Roy Smith, Gabe Lefevre, and John Peterson, were paralyzed. Beck described them as stunned and incredulous. They crowded to the far end of the cabin, away from the door, away from the chinking gaps. They clutched their rifles, but they didn't shoot. They were witnessing something that their minds couldn't process. They were miners. They dealt in hard rock and gravity. This was a nightmare come to life. Beck and Marion Smith were the only ones fighting back. They fired round after round through the door. They fired through the gaps. They were fighting for their lives. But the creatures were smart. They realized the walls were too thick. They realized the door was too braced. They realized that the thunder sticks the men were holding could only hurt them if they were in front of the gun. So they moved. The sound of feet on the ground stopped, and the trampling stopped. For a moment, there was silence again. The men lowered their rifles, chests heaving, sweat stinging their eyes. The smell of gun smoke was thick and acrid, burning their throats. Had they given up? Had the bullets finally driven them off? Then they heard it. It came from above. The blood drained from Fred Beck's face. He looked up at the ceiling, the thin layer of cedar that separated them from the night sky. The heavy thud of weight shifting on the roof beams echoed through the cabin. Dust drifted down from the rafters. The creatures had taken the high ground. They were on the roof. And unlike the walls, the roof wasn't made of thick logs. It was made of split wood. It was fragile. The sound of a roof being dismantled from the outside is distinct. It is the sound of vulnerability. Inside the cabin, the five miners stood frozen, their eyes locked on the ceiling rafters, tracing the heavy, deliberate movements of the creatures above. The cedar groaned under the weight. Dust and pine needles drifted down in thin streams, illuminated by the dying embers of the fireplace. Fred Beck and Marion Smith tracked the noise with the barrels of their rifles. They were no longer shooting at shadows in the distance. They were preparing to shoot at something less than 10 feet away, separated only by a layer of wood and tar paper. The attack had evolved. The rock throwing had been an intimidation tactic. The pushing on the walls had been a test of structural integrity. But climbing onto the roof, that was predatory. Then the digging started. The sound was guttural, the tearing of wood, the ripping of shingles. A section of the roof began to buckle. The creatures weren't just walking up there. They were looking for a weak point. Beck yelled to the others, his voice cracking over the noise, telling them to stay back. The three men in the corner, Roy, Gabe, and John, were huddled together, their faces pale masks of terror. One of them held a pistol, his hand shaking so violently that the weapon was useless. They were witnessing the impossible, and it had stripped them of their capacity to act. It fell to Beck and Smith to hold the line. Marion fired around directly through the roof, aiming for the sound of the footsteps. The bullet punched a hole in the cedar, a shaft of moonlight piercing the smoky haze of the cabin. A scream, or a grunt, maybe something between a human shout and an animal roar, echoed from above. But the digging didn't stop. If anything, it became more frantic. And then it happened. A section of the roof, near the edge of the wall, gave way. It didn't collapse entirely, but a hole was torn open, jagged and gaping. And through that hole, something reached in. Fred Beck stared at it, his mind struggling to process the anatomy. It was massive. It was covered in dark, coarse hair. But the structure was undeniably, terrifyingly human-like. Long, thick fingers, a wide palm, and a thumb. The hand wasn't just flailing blindly. It was reaching for something specific. Hanging from the rafters, tucked into the crossbeams, was a supply of weapons and tools. The miners kept their axes and potential weapons up high, out of the way. The creature had evidently seen the axe, or perhaps sensed it, and was trying to grab it. Just imagine the intelligence required for that action. A bear reaches for food. A raccoon reaches for shiny objects. This creature was reaching for a weapon. It was trying to disarm them, or worse, it was trying to arm itself. The hairy hand closed around the handle of one of the miner's axes. Fred Beck didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He reacted with a surge of adrenaline that slowed time to a crawl. He saw the fingers tighten around the smooth wood of the handle. He saw the arm tense, preparing to pull the heavy tool up through the hole in the roof. If the creature got the axe, the siege would be over. A creature with the strength to knock chinking loose, armed with a double-bitted axe, could chop through the roof in seconds. They would be defenseless. Beck lunged. He didn't shoot. He was too close and the angle was wrong. He grabbed the head of the axe, the heavy steel blade. In a move of desperate improvisation, Beck twisted the axe head. He rotated it violently, jamming the steel bit against the log rafters. The handle turned, locking the tool in place. The creature pulled. Beck held on. It was a tug-of-war between man and monster. The creature grunted, heaving against the resistance. Beck's boots skidded on the floor, his muscles burning. He was fighting a being that outweighed him by hundreds of pounds, a being with the leverage of the high ground. "Shoot him," Beck screamed. Marion Smith was already moving. He swung the barrel of the Remington automatic toward the hole in the roof. He didn't have a clear view of the body, but he saw the arm. He saw the struggle. The shot was deafening in the confined space. The bullet tore into the wood, inches from Beck's own hand. Marion had fired a proximity shot, willing to risk hitting his partner to break the stalemate. The creature shrieked. The grip on the axe handle instantly released. The hairy hand recoiled, vanishing back through the hole in the roof as if it had been burned. Beck stumbled back, clutching the axe to his chest. He pulled the handle down, securing the weapon. He threw it into a corner, far away from the ceiling, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. They had won the skirmish, but the war wasn't over. The creature on the roof didn't retreat. It retaliated. Moments later, a heavy rock smashed through the hole the creature had made. It struck the floor with a dull thud. Then another. They were using the breach as a firing port. Beck scrambled for cover, but he wasn't fast enough. A rock hurled with tremendous force from above struck him. The accounts vary slightly here, but the impact was severe. Beck was hit in the head or the upper body. The force of the blow knocked him to the ground. The world started to spin, and darkness encroached on his vision. He didn't lose consciousness completely, but he was dazed. He was out of the fight. He lay on the floor, the rough wood pressing against his cheek, listening to the chaos continue. Marion Smith was still firing. The smell of gunpowder was suffocating. The dust was thick. Then a strange thing happened. The attack stopped. The creatures didn't leave. They just stopped. The trampling on the roof stopped, and the rock stopped falling. It settled into a sinister, heavy silence. This was the lull that veteran soldiers know well. The enemy isn't gone. They are regrouping. They are waiting. Inside the cabin, the tension shifted from frantic action to a slow, agonizing dread. The men huddled together. Beck, recovering from the blow, sat up, rubbing his head. They whispered to each other, afraid that even their voices would provoke another assault. Marion Smith, the tough leader, began to sing. It wasn't a song of victory. It was a nursery rhyme, a plea. "If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and we'll all go home in the morning." He sang it over and over, his voice trembling. Fred Beck later wrote, "He did not mean it to be humorous, for Hank was dead serious. Marion was singing to the mountain devils, hoping that maybe they understood English, hoping they could be reasoned with. The image is haunting. 5 grown men, armed with high-powered rifles, cowering in a dark cabin in the middle of the wilderness, while their leader sings a lullaby to the monsters on the roof. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. Every creak of the logs sent rifles snapping up. Every gust of wind sounded like a scream. They didn't sleep. They didn't eat. They just watched the cracks in the walls, waiting for the hairy hand to return. They were exhausted. They were wounded. Their psychological defenses were shattered. The cabin, once their sanctuary, had become a coffin. But as the hours ticked by, and the black of the night began to turn to gray, the windowless cabin remained dark, but the light leaking through the gaps changed. Dawn in the mountains doesn't break. It bleeds. Inside the cabin, the transition from night to day was a slow, agonizing shift in the quality of the darkness. The pitch-black gloom that had hidden the monsters for 6 hours slowly turned into a milky gray twilight. The men huddled against the far wall away from the door, watched the cracks with bloodshot eyes. They had survived the night, but now they faced a different kind of terror. The exposure of the day. For hours, the sounds of the siege had ceased. The thumping, the scratching, the rocks rolling down the roof. It had all faded away with the coming of the light. But silence in the wilderness is a liar. The men knew that the Siatic were intelligent. They knew they were patient. Was the silence a retreat, or was it an ambush? Marion Smith, the man who had sung nursery rhymes in the dark to keep his sanity, was now back in command. He looked at the others, Roy, Gabe, John, and Fred. They were pale, covered in dust from the chimney and the roof. They looked like ghosts. Fred Beck checked his Winchester. He checked the axe he had fought for. He looked at Marion, was now staring at the door with a grim determination. "We have to go," Marion whispered. The plan was simple. Get to the car. But the execution was a nightmare. The Ford Model T was parked miles away down a rugged trail that wound through the very timberline the creatures called home. To get there, they had to open the door. They had to step out of their wooden armor and walk into the open. They didn't pack. This is a crucial detail that speaks to the level of their fear. These were men who lived on the margins of the economy. They had hundreds of dollars worth of equipment in that cabin. Drills, powder, food, tools. In 1924, that was a fortune. To walk away from it was financial suicide. But Marion Smith made the call that likely saved their lives. It's better to lose them than our lives. They left it all. The blasting powder, the heavy coats, the extra food. They took only what they could carry on their backs, and most importantly, their rifles. Fred Beck moved to the door. He had the axe he had wrestled from the creature. He had his .30-30 Winchester. He took a breath that tasted of stale smoke and fear, and he lifted the brace, the pole they had jammed against the door frame. He pushed the heavy log door open. The morning air rushed in, cold and sweet, smelling of pine resin and damp earth. It was a shock to the system after the stifling, dusty air of the cabin. Beck stepped out first, rifle raised, scanning the perimeter. The damage was immediate and visible. The ground around the cabin was littered with rocks, the ammunition of the siege. The roof shingles were scattered. The area looked like a battlefield, but the forest itself was quiet. The sun was just hitting the tops of the fir trees, painting them in gold. It looked peaceful, it looked innocent, but the peace didn't last. Beck scanned the ridge, the high ground where the whistling had come from the night before. His eyes locked on movement. There, standing on the edge of Ape Canyon, about 80 yards away, was one of them. It wasn't hiding. It was standing on the precipice, looking down at the cabin, watching them leave. Beck didn't hesitate. The memory of the hairy hand reaching through the roof, the memory of the rock smashing into the wall, it all coalesced into a single instinct. He wasn't a prospector anymore. He was a combatant. He raised the Winchester. The iron sights settled on the dark, hulking figure against the morning sky. The rifle shot shattered the morning silence. Beck didn't stop at one. He worked the lever action. 3 shots. Beck was a marksman. He saw the impact. The creature didn't run this time. It didn't dodge behind a tree. It simply toppled. Beck watched as the massive body lost its balance and fell forward, tumbling over the edge of the cliff. It plummeted down into the gorge. The canyon walls there are steep, dropping hundreds of feet into the churning water of the muddy river below. "I got him," Beck said, and he just stood there, watching the empty space where the monster had been. Marion Smith didn't wait to check the kill. "Let's get out of here." The retreat began. It wasn't a walk, it was a forced march. 5 men, heavily armed, moving fast down the trail. They looked for an ambush. Every shadow that stretched across the trail looked like a giant. Every snap of a twig sounded like a flank attack. They moved with the desperate energy of men who felt the breath of the predator on their necks. The forest, usually their workplace, had become alien territory. They were interlopers, and they were being evicted. They reached the Ford Model T without incident. The sight of the car must have felt like a religious experience. They threw their packs in. They threw themselves in. Marion cranked the engine, and the sputtering roar of the motor was the sweetest sound they had ever heard. They drove away from the plains of Abraham, away from Pumice Butte, away from the dark divide, and they didn't stop until they hit civilization. But the story didn't end on the drive home. It exploded. When they reached the town of Kelso, Washington, the adrenaline began to wear off, replaced by a need to tell someone, to validate what had happened. You don't survive a siege by monsters and then go home and make a sandwich. You go to the authorities. Marion Smith went to the ranger station at Spirit Lake, and he found Ranger William Welch. The conversation that followed is a classic example of the collision between two worlds. Marion Smith, a veteran woodsman shaking with residual adrenaline, stood before a federal officer and reported a murder, or at least a self-defense killing. He told Ranger Welch that they had been attacked. He told him about the rock. He told him about the shooting. "I shot a mountain devil," Marion said. Ranger Welch, a man of the government, a man of rational explanations, paused. He looked at this seasoned miner. "You mean a bear?" he asked. "No," Marion insisted. "It was a mountain devil." The ranger was puzzled. He didn't have a box on his form for mountain devil. He didn't have a protocol for a siege by mythical beasts. He promised to investigate, but you can imagine the skepticism in his eyes. Marion Smith, despite his initial reluctance, let the cat out of the bag. He told his friends and he told the local. And in 1924, a story like that travels faster than a telegraph. The local newspapers, the Oregonian, the Kelsoian, caught wind of it. Reporters smelled blood. This wasn't just a miner's tall tale. This was a sensation. 5 respectable men abandoning a gold mine, claiming war with ape men. It was front-page gold. The headline screamed, "Ape men attack miners." They were about to become celebrities, pariahs, and legends, all in the span of a news cycle. As the story of the Ape Canyon attack hit the wire services, it ignited a hysteria that swept through the Pacific Northwest like a wildfire. It was July 1924. The country was in the roaring 20s. People were hungry for distraction, for sensation, for something wild to break the monotony of the modern world. And 5 miners claiming to have fought a war with prehistoric giants fit the bill perfectly. The quiet solitude of Mount St. Helens was shattered. Almost overnight, the mountain was invaded, not by scientists or biologists. It was invaded by the great ape hunt. Local reporters from Portland and Seattle flocked to Kelso. They interviewed the miners, scribbling down every terrifying detail, the hairy hand, the thumping, the whistling. But they weren't alone. A big game hunter from England reportedly arrived, carrying an elephant gun, ready to bag the trophy of the century. Detective bureaus sent agents. Tourists packed picnic baskets and drove their cars as far up the logging roads as they could, hoping to catch a glimpse of a monster from the safety of their running boards. It was a circus, and in the center ring were the Rangers, J.H. Huffman and William Welch. The Forest Service Rangers responsible for the district were tasked with restoring order. They had to investigate the claims, not necessarily because they believed in Mountain Devil, but because they had a public safety issue on their hand. Armed posses were roaming the woods, shooting at shadows. It was a recipe for disaster. The Rangers mounted an expedition to the site. They were accompanied by a few of the miners, including Fred Beck, who returned to the scene of the crime despite the trauma. Beck wanted vindication. He wanted to show them the body in the canyon. He wanted to prove he wasn't crazy. They arrived at the cabin. The scene was frozen in time. The evidence of the siege was undeniable. The cabin was battered. The chinking was knocked out. Stones were scattered across the floor. The heavy door showed signs of stress. And inside, the supplies the men had abandoned, the powder, the tools, the food were strewn about. But where were the monsters? Fred Beck led the Rangers to the edge of the canyon. He pointed to the spot where he had shot the creature on the rim. He pointed down into the gorge, 400 feet below, where the body should have fallen. They looked down. Nothing. The gorge was empty. No massive, hairy corpse lay on the rocks. No vultures were circling. Beck was devastated. He offered theories. Maybe the river had washed the body away. The melting snow water flows heavily in the summer afternoons. Or perhaps, as he would later come to believe, the other creatures had retrieved their fallen comrade, dragging the body back to some hidden lava tube to mourn. The Rangers were less than charitable. Ranger Huffman, a skeptic by trade, looked at the ground. He found the famous footprints, the 14-inch tracks that had terrified the miners. He knelt down in the soft pumice dust. Then he performed the act that would become the cornerstone of skepticism. Huffman balled his hand into a fist. He pressed his knuckles into the dust. Then he pressed his palm down. He looked at the reporter standing nearby and said, "See." He claimed that the toes of the track were just the impressions of knuckles. He claimed that the heel was just the palm print. He demonstrated that a human could fake these tracks. The knuckle theory was born. The Rangers officially concluded that there were no ape men. They suggested that the whole thing was a prank, or a case of cabin fever gone wrong, or perhaps the work of mischievous campers from the nearby campsite at Spirit Lake. The verdict was in: hoax or hysteria. The newspapers ran with it, the excitement fizzled, the posses went home. The great ape hunt ended not with a bang, but with a scoff. But the Rangers' explanation had holes large enough to drive a Model T through. First, there was the sheer violence of the attack. Could a group of campers hike miles up a mountain in the middle of the night, carry heavy rocks, and bombard a cabin occupied by 5 armed men? Would pranksters risk getting shot by 30-30 rifles just for a laugh? Second, there was the missing equipment. The miners left behind tools and explosives. Why would they abandon their livelihood for a prank? And third, there was the physical damage to the cabin. Knuckles in the dust might explain a footprint, but they don't explain a roof torn open or a door nearly battered down. The official story tried to put the genie back in the bottle. They wanted the woods to be safe again. They wanted the mountain devils to go back to being Indian legends, but the legend wouldn't die. It festered. For decades, the story of Ape Canyon remained a local myth, whispered in taverns in Kelso and Amboy. The miners, particularly Marion Smith, retreated into silence, tired of being ridiculed. Then, nearly 60 years later, a new twist emerged. A man named Rant Mullins. In 1982, Mullins, a retired logger, came forward with a confession. He told the Vancouver Columbian that he was the man behind the Ape Canyon incident. He claimed that he and his uncle had rolled rock over the edge of the canyon to scare the miners. He claimed he had carved wooden feet to make the tracks. The skeptics rejoiced. Finally, a confession. Case closed. But wait, look closer at the confession. Mullins said he rolled rocks from the rim, but the miners described rocks hitting the walls of the cabin from all sides. Passive rock rolling doesn't knock out tinking from the inside. Mullins said he carved the feet in 1928. The attack happened in 1924. Mullins claimed it was a joke. But would 2 men joke with 5 armed miners who were firing live ammunition? The confession, upon scrutiny, falls apart. It bears all the hallmarks of an old man looking for a slice of fame attached to a legendary event. It doesn't fit the forensics, and it doesn't fit the timeline. So, we are left with the paradox. The Rangers said it was knuckles. Mullins said it was rocks. The miners said it was monsters. For nearly a century, that was where the story stood. A stalemate between the believers and the debunkers. A campfire story with no ending. But the earth keeps its secrets, and sometimes it decides to give them back. History has a way of disappearing in the Pacific Northwest. In the high country, the elements are relentless. The snow crushes, the rain rots, and the volcanic soil swallows. A log cabin, no matter how sturdy, doesn't last long against a century of winters. For decades, the physical location of the Vanderwhite mine was considered lost, a ghost coordinate on a map that no longer matched the terrain. The cabin was gone. The mine shaft had likely collapsed or been filled in. The trail was overgrown. For the skeptics, this was convenient. If you can't find the crime scene, you can't prove the crime. The Ape Canyon incident was relegated to the realm of campfire ghost stories, with no more physical reality than Paul Bunyan or the jackalope. In the early 21st century, the legend of Ape Canyon found a new champion. Not a ghost hunter, but a historian with a metal detector. His name is Mark Mersell. Mersell wasn't interested in speculation. He was interested in the forensics. He understood that if the story was true, if 5 men really lived there, mined there, and fought a battle there, they would have left a footprint, not a footprint in the mud, but a footprint in the archaeological record. He went back to the source. He dug through the county archives, pulling the original mining claims filed by Marion Smith and his partners. He triangulated the old survey markers against the modern topography, which had been radically altered by the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. It was a needle in a haystack made of volcanic ash, but he found it. On a steep slope, hidden beneath layers of moss and debris, Marcel found the faint rectangular outline of a foundation. The logs were long gone, rotted into humus, but the scar remained in the earth. He turned on his metal detector, the silence of the forest, broken only by the high-pitched whine of the machine. He dug. The first artifacts he pulled from the soil were mundane, but critical. Square nails. To the layman, a nail is a nail. To an archaeologist, a square nail is a timestamp. Square-cut nails were the standard before the wire nail took over. Finding them confirmed that this structure dated back to the early 20th century. It put the cabin in the right era. Then he found baling wire. This might seem like trash, but it matched the specific details of the miners' accounts. They had used wire to patch repairs, to bind logs. It was the duct tape of 1924, but the smoking gun was yet to come. Marcel continued to sweep the interior of the foundation, the space where the men would have huddled in the dark. The detector screamed again. He brushed away the dirt and pulled out a small, tarnished cylinder of brass, a 30-30 rifle casing. These were spent casings. They had been fired, and crucially, they were found inside the perimeter of the cabin. Let's pause and consider the implications of this. If the Ape Canyon story was a hoax concocted by the men in a bar in Kelso, why would they go up to the mountain and shoot off rounds inside their own cabin? If the story was a prank by local teenagers rolling rocks, why would the miners be firing high-powered rifles inside the structure? The presence of the spent shell casings inside the cabin foundation provides physical corroboration for the most violent part of the narrative, the siege. It proves that the men were shooting out. It proves that they were defending the perimeter from within. These men weren't shooting at trees for target practice. You don't fire a 30-30 inside a small windowless log cabin unless you have a very good reason. The noise would be deafening. The concussion would be brutal. You only do that if the alternative, letting the thing outside get in, is worse. Marcel's excavation turned the Ape Canyon legend from a tall tale into a forensic event. We now know, with a high degree of certainty, that in 1924, a group of heavily armed men was besieged in that cabin. We know they fired their weapons repeatedly. We know they abandoned valuable equipment. The physical evidence supports the siege narrative. It proves the battle happened. But archaeology has its limits. It can find the bullets, but it can't find the targets. The casings prove the men fought, but they didn't tell us what they were fighting. Was it a troop of aggressive territorial apes, a manifestation of spirits, or was it something that exists in the cracks between our understanding of biology and physics? 43 years after the sun rose over the battered cabin at Ape Canyon, Fred Beck finally sat down to write his book. He was an old man by then. The world had changed. The mystery of the wild man had been rebranded as Bigfoot, a cultural icon of the Pacific Northwest. But Beck didn't write a book about biology. The title was I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens, but the content was a revelation. In his later years, Beck had moved away from the simple monsters explanation. He'd spent decades trying to reconcile what he saw, the physical blood and fur, with the impossible nature of the event, the disappearing bodies, the glowing eyes, the overwhelming sense of spiritual dread. Beck proposed a theory that was radical for 1967 and still challenges researchers today. He claimed that the creatures were not entirely of this world. He wrote, "They are not entirely of the world. They are from a lower plane." Beck believed that they were interdimensional beings. He argued that they exist on a vibration slightly different from our own. Most of the time, they are invisible to us, existing in the ethereal realm. But under certain conditions, when the vibrations align, or when they choose to, they can manifest in the physical world. When they manifest, they are solid. They leave footprints. They have mass. They can break a branch, throw a rock, and be shot by a rifle. But when they die, or when they choose to leave, they simply shift back. They dematerialize. This, Beck argued, is why we never find a body. This is why the tracks stop in the middle of a snowfield. This is why the miners looked down into the gorge and saw nothing but rocks. They are a missing link in consciousness, Beck wrote, neither animal nor human. It is a theory that frustrates the scientist, but it resonates with the mystic. It aligns perfectly with the indigenous lore of the night people who could vanish at will, who could speak in the minds of men, and who were the guardians of the spirit world. So what really happened at Ape Canyon? Did 5 men suffer a collective breakdown, fueled by isolation and infrasound, firing their guns at shadows until they terrified themselves into a retreat? Did they encounter a relic population of Gigantopithecus, a flesh and blood ape that has managed to evade modern science in the dense forests of the Cascades? Or did they cross a line that wasn't on any map? Did they stumble into a liminal zone, a thin place where the veil between our reality and the ancient shadow is torn? The Siege of Ape Canyon endures because it refuses to be solved. It sits at the crossroads. It has the physical evidence of a crime scene, the casings, the tracks, the cabin, but the perpetrators vanished like ghosts. The Vander White mine is gone now. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens reshaped the landscape, burying much of the history under tons of gray ash. The plains of Abraham are even more desolate today than they were in 1924. But if you go there, if you hike the Lewitt Trail, past the pumice fields and the twisted stumps, you might still feel it. Hikers in the area still report it today. A sudden silence in the woods, the feeling of being watched from the ridgeline, and sometimes just as the sun goes down, you will hear a thumping sound, a deep hollow booming, like the earth beating its chest. The miners are long dead. The cabin is now in ruins, but the watchers, they are still there, and they are still guarding the gate. So keep your fire bright, and if you look into the tree line, you might not like what looks back. As we step back from the crossroads, remember the story doesn't end here, because this is just the beginning, searching for the knowledge and wisdom to unravel the mysteries of our universe. Unexplained sightings, spirits, and science. They are all connected in the grand tapestry of life. So remember, keep pulling at the threads, because this has been Crossroads of the Veil.